You know, in the world of high-stakes motorsport, the difference between a grid penalty and a championship trophy is often just a matter of who tells the better story to the scrutineers. We like to think of racing as this pure pursuit of speed, where the fastest driver wins. But the reality? The reality is a lot messier, a lot darker, and frankly, a lot more interesting. It's a place where engineering brilliance and outright deception hold hands and skip through the gray areas of the rulebook. And nowhere was that gray area more beautifully exploited than at the 2006 Daytona 500. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the mechanical secrets that teams try to bury. If you're someone who loves uncovering the hidden engineering that defines motorsport history, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Here's the thing about NASCAR in the mid-2000s. It wasn't just a racing series, it was an arms race. We were deep in the era of the Generation 4 car, which, if you ask any driver from that time, was a beast. These cars were twisted, literally. They were crab walking down the straights, body skewed to catch the air, engine screaming at 9,000 RPM. But by 2006, the box that the teams had to work within was getting smaller and smaller. NASCAR had seen enough. They were cracking down. The rulebook, which used to be a pamphlet you could arguably misinterpret, had evolved into this massive phone book-sized document of thou shalt nots. Every inch of the car was measured. Every angle was scrutinized. They had templates for the roof, templates for the spoiler, templates for the fenders. Officials would literally crawl under the chassis with flashlights and mirrors looking for anything that didn't look like a factory part. Now, you might be thinking, if the rules were that tight, how could anyone possibly cheat without getting caught immediately? Well, that's where it gets really interesting, because rules, by their very nature, are reactive. A rule is written because someone did something yesterday that the organizers didn't like. But a true innovator, a real legend of the garage, isn't looking at what was banned yesterday. They're looking at the empty white space on the page, the things the rulebook hasn't even thought to mention yet. Enter Chad Knaus. If you follow the sport, you know the name. Knaus wasn't just a crew chief. He was a frantic, obsessive, brilliant architect of speed. He was the guy who would stay up for 3 days straight staring at a suspension linkage, wondering if he could shave a gram of weight or find a millimeter of travel. And in February 2006, the pressure on Knaus and the entire Hendrick Motorsports 48 team was immense. Jimmie Johnson was fast, sure, they had been close to the championship, but close doesn't pay the bills in racing, and it certainly doesn't secure your legacy. They needed an edge, not a small edge, not a we found a better spark plug edge. They needed a weapon. The problem was the track itself, Daytona. The great American race. Daytona isn't like a short track where you can muscle your way to the front, and it's not like a road course where finesse is everything. Daytona is a chess match played at 190 miles per hour in a hurricane. It's all about aerodynamics. Air is the invisible hand that either holds you on the track or throws you into the wall. At those speeds, the air feels like water. It's thick, it's heavy, and how your car cuts through that heavy air determines everything. Ideally, you want two things that are physically contradictory. In the corners, you want downforce. You want the air to push the car into the asphalt so the tires stick and you can turn without lifting off the throttle. But on the straights, downforce is your enemy. Downforce creates drag. Drag is like a parachute dragging behind the car. So you have this fundamental engineering paradox. Build a car that turns well and it will be slow on the straights. Build a car that is fast on the straights and it will spin out in the corners. Every crew chief in the garage had to compromise. They had to pick a lane. Except Chad Knaus. He looked at this paradox and decided he didn't want to compromise. He wanted both. He wanted a car that could transform, a shapeshifter. Here's what most people don't realize about the suspension of a stock car. It is archaic. We're talking about technology that dates back to pickup trucks from the 1960s. Solid rear axle, truck arms, coil springs. It's heavy, crude iron. But in that simplicity, there is opportunity. One of the key components keeping that solid rear axle in place is something called the track bar. Picture a metal rod, about the thickness of a broomstick, but made of high-strength steel. It connects the frame of the car on one side to the axle on the other. Its job is to keep the rear end centered. If you push the car sideways, the track bar stops the axle from sliding out from under the car. But it does more than that. It controls the roll center of the rear suspension, and this is critical. If you raise the track bar, you raise the roll center. This makes the rear of the car want to roll less, but it also makes it looser, meaning the back end wants to slide out. If you lower the track bar, the car tightens up. It feels more planted, more secure. Drivers are constantly fighting the balance of the car as fuel burns off and tires wear down. A car that starts the race tight might end the race loose. For years, this adjustment had to be done in the pits. A crew member would stick a long wrench through a hole in the rear window and crank the adjuster during a tire change. But around 2005, NASCAR threw the teams a bone. They allowed an in-car track bar adjuster. This was a simple mechanical system, a cable or a screw drive connected to a knob or a switch on the dashboard. The driver could now raise or lower that bar while driving at 180 miles per hour. If the car felt loose entering turn 3, they could drop the bar an inch and fix it instantly. It was a great tool, perfectly legal. Every team had one. It was mandated, regulated, and inspected. When the NASCAR officials looked at a car, they expected to see the cables running from the dash to the rear deck. They expected to see the mechanism on the rear axle. It was the most boring, standard part of the car. And that is exactly why it was the perfect hiding place. See, Chad Knaus understood something about human psychology that is just as important as engineering. If you want to hide something, you don't build a secret compartment. Secret compartments get found. If you want to hide something, you put it inside the thing everyone is already looking at. You take the legal system, the one the inspectors see 100 times a day, and you make it do something illegal. Knaus looked at that track bar adjuster and thought, okay, I have a cable running from the driver's hand to the back of the car. I have a mechanism that creates force and movement. Why should it only move the track bar? This is where the genius kicks in. He wasn't looking at the suspension anymore. He was looking at the rear window. Now, to the casual observer, the rear window of a race car is just a piece of Lexan polycarbonate. It's there to keep the wind out. But aerodynamically, the rear window is prime real estate. The air flowing over the roof has to transition down the back of the car to the spoiler. If that transition is smooth, the spoiler works great. If the transition is messy, if the air separates and becomes turbulent, the spoiler loses efficiency. The ideal shape for that window changes depending on what you're doing. When the car is going straight, you want the window to lay back, sleek and slippery, letting the air flow cleanly over it to reduce drag. But in the corner, the car is yawed out. It's sideways. The air is hitting the car at an angle. In that specific moment, you want the window to stand up a little straighter. You want it to catch the air, to guide it forcefully onto the spoiler, to plant the rear tires. But the window is rigid. It's bolted to the chassis. It can't move. The rules say the body must be stationary. The rules say the roof height and the window angle are fixed measurements. Chad Knaus looked at the rulebook, looked at his track bar adjuster, and then looked at the C-pillars, the metal posts that hold the rear window in place. And he had an idea that was so audacious, so risky, that it arguably shouldn't have worked. What if the driver, when he reached for that knob to adjust his suspension, was actually reshaping the entire back of the car? What if the car could breathe? To pull this off, they would need to build a mechanism that was invisible. It had to be strong enough to bend steel and polycarbonate against the force of a 200-mile-per-hour wind, but delicate enough that a driver could operate it with one hand while battling 42 other cars. And most importantly, it had to sit right under the noses of the most paranoid, detail-oriented technical inspectors on the planet without raising a single eyebrow. The plan was set. The target was Daytona, and the device they were about to build would become the stuff of legend, a piece of mechanical deception so effective that even after they were caught, the sport didn't know whether to applaud or arrest them. Now, you have to understand the anatomy of a race car to really appreciate the insanity of what they built. The area we are talking about is called the C-pillar. If you look at your own car, it's the metal post between the rear window and the rear side glass. On a street car, it's structural. On a race car, it's part of the roll cage geometry, covered in sheet metal. It is supposed to be solid rock. If you walked up to a stock car in 2006 and pushed on the C-pillar, it shouldn't budge. It's welded steel. But Knaus and his team of engineers at Hendrick Motorsport started asking dangerous questions. How solid does it really have to be? And more importantly, how solid does it look versus how solid is it actually? The device they engineered was a masterpiece of hidden linkage. It started with that legal track bar adjuster we talked about. In a normal setup, turning the knob in the cockpit pulls a cable that rotates a gear in the rear suspension. Simple, linear. But on Jimmie Johnson's car, that cable had a split personality. They installed a secondary system, a ghost system. When Johnson turned the knob, yes, it moved the track bar, but simultaneously, hidden deep within the bowels of the chassis, a second cable was being actuated. This cable didn't go down to the suspension, it went up. Using aircraft-grade steel braided lines, stuff that looks exactly like the brake lines or cool suit hoses already cluttering the interior, they routed this secret cable through the hollow tubing of the roll cage itself. Think about that for a second. The roll cage is the skeleton of the car. It's made of steel tubing. Knaus used the inside of the skeleton as a conduit for his nervous system. The cable ran up the main hoop, back along the roof bars, and terminated right at the mounting points of those C-pillars. This is where the fabrication team earned their paychecks. They modified the mounting brackets of the rear window. To the naked eye, to the inspector holding a flashlight 2 inches away, they looked like standard factory welded steel mounts. But they weren't welds, they were hinges. Incredible, microscopic, high-tension hinges disguised as welds. When Johnson cranked that handle inside the car, the cable would pull tight. It would exert hundreds of pounds of force on the C-pillars, literally bowing them outward and changing the angle of the rear window. We aren't talking about feet of movement here. We are talking about fractions of an inch, maybe an eighth of an inch, maybe a quarter. Now, you might be thinking, who cares about a quarter of an inch? In your driveway, nobody. At 190 miles per hour, a quarter of an inch is the difference between a car that drives like a Cadillac and a car that drives like a shopping cart with a wobbly wheel. By bowing the window and pillars, they could manipulate the airflow separation point. When Johnson needed grip, like in the middle of turns 1 and 2 where the car wants to slide up the track, he would crank the adjuster. The window would stand up, the air would catch the spoiler, and the rear tires would be planted into the asphalt as if an invisible giant was sitting on the trunklet. The car would rotate beautifully. He could hug the yellow line while everyone else was washing up the track. Then, as he exploded off the corner onto the massive superstretch, he would crank the knob the other way. The tension would release. The window would lay back down, flattening out. The drag would disappear. The car would become a slippery bullet, cutting through the air with less resistance than the guy next to him. He was driving a transformer. While Tony Stewart and Jeff Gordon were stuck with the setup they started with, Jimmie Johnson was essentially redesigning his car 2 times every single lap. But building it was only half the battle. The real nightmare was the Room of Doom. That's what the teams call the NASCAR Technical Inspection Bay. It's a sterile, terrifying place. The car is pushed on a flat surface plate. Templates, massive metal silhouettes shaped like the perfect car, are dropped onto the body. If the template touches metal where it shouldn't, or if there's a gap where there shouldn't be, you fail. If you fail badly enough, they confiscate your car and fine you into oblivion. This is where Knaus's hiding in plain sight strategy was genius. The inspectors knew about the track bar adjuster. They expected to see cables. They expected to see tension. By integrating the cheats into a legal system, Knaus provided a decoy. If an inspector saw a cable move, his brain said, "Oh, that's the track bar." He didn't look further. He didn't trace the line up the roll bar because why would a suspension cable go to the roof? It defies logic. The team tested this thing in absolute secrecy. They didn't just run it at the track where spies from other teams, Roush, Gibbs, Childress, might see something weird with a telephoto lens. They did the heavy lifting indoors. They used the 7-post shaker, a multi-million-dollar hydraulic rig that simulates a lap of Daytona without the car ever moving an inch. They dialed in the stiffness. They made sure that when the window moved, it didn't creak, pop, or snap. The silence of the mechanism was just as important as the movement. Then came the wind tunnel. This is hallowed ground. In the wind tunnel, the numbers don't lie. And the numbers they were seeing were staggering. The data showed a massive swing in counts of downforce. We're talking about a competitive advantage that is usually measured in hundredths of a second, suddenly being measured in tenths. In racing, a tenth of a second is an eternity. A tenth of a second is the difference between being a hero and being unemployed. But there was a risk. A massive, catastrophic risk. The mechanism relied on tension. If a cable snapped during the race, the rear window could collapse. If a hinge broke, the roof could peel back. Or perhaps worse, if the mechanism got stuck in the high drag position, Johnson would be a sitting duck on the straights, getting passed by cars with half the horsepower. And then there was the human element. Jimmie Johnson had to drive the car. He had to race at nearly 200 miles per hour, drafting inches from other cars, managing tire wear, listening to a spotter, and effectively managing a manual transmission of aerodynamics. He had to remember, turn 1, crank left, backstretch, crank right, turn 3, crank left, front stretch, crank right. Do that 200 times. Don't forget, don't screw up, and don't let anyone see you doing it. The psychological burden on Johnson was immense. He knew the car was illegal. He knew that if they were caught, the Daytona 500 win, the biggest prize in American motorsport, would be stripped. His reputation would be tarnished. But he also knew that this was his job. In that era, if your crew chief gave you a car that bent the rules, you didn't ask questions. You drove the wheels off it. February 2006 rolled around. The haulers arrived at Daytona. The atmosphere was electric. The new season was starting, and everyone was talking about who had found speed over the winter. The Hendrick 48 car rolled out of the back of the transporter, gleaming in Lowe's blue and silver. It looked perfect. It looked legal. It passed the initial inspection. The templates fit. The heights were good. The officials signed off. Chad Knaus must have felt a mix of pure adrenaline and absolute terror as he watched the officials run their hands over the rear window, completely unaware that they were touching a loaded weapon. The trap was set. The car was on the grid. But as the engines fired and the field began to roll for the biggest race of the year, nobody, not the fans, not the announcers, and certainly not the competition, realized that the race had actually been decided months ago in a dark room in North Carolina with a spool of cable and a refusal to accept the laws of physics. The green flag was about to drop, and the deception was about to go live on national television. The 2006 Daytona 500 didn't just start. It exploded into chaos, as restrictor plate races always do. But amidst the thunder of 43 engines and the blur of color at 190 miles per hour, something strange was happening with the number 48 Chevrolet. To the untrained eye, it just looked fast. But to the trained eyes, the other crew chiefs standing on top of their pit boxes, binoculars glued to their faces, it looked wrong. Not wrong in a bad way, wrong in a physics doesn't work like that way. Usually, at Daytona, when you are buried in traffic, your car becomes a handful. The dirty air, the turbulent weight coming off the cars in front of you makes the front end wash out and the rear end feel light. Drivers are constantly sawing at the wheel, fighting for every inch of grip. But Johnson's hands were calm. His car was glued to the yellow line. He was driving through the corners with a level of precision that shouldn't have been possible in that much traffic. The NBC broadcast team was practically gushing over it. Darrell Waltrip, a three-time champion who knows exactly what a loose race car looks like, kept pointing it out. "Look at that 48 car," he'd say. "It's just planted. It goes exactly where Jimmie points it." What Waltrip didn't know, what nobody knew, was that every time Jimmie entered turn 1, his left hand was subtly dropping off the steering wheel to flick that adjuster. Click. The window stood up. The car hunkered down. He could drive it deeper, turn it harder, and get back to the gas sooner than anyone else. Then, as he exited turn 2 onto the huge backstretch, click, the window laid back down. The drag vanished. While the cars behind him were hitting an aerodynamic wall, Johnson was slipping through a hole in the air that he had created for himself. It was the perfect crime. The race played out like a script written by Hendrick Motorsports. Johnson led laps, he saved fuel, he stayed out of trouble, and when it came down to the final shootout, the last 10 laps where legends are made, he had an ace up his sleeve that nobody else had. With just a few laps to go, Johnson was battling Casey Mears and Ryan Newman. The tension was palpable. In a normal car, you have to choose your line carefully. If you go low, you might get pinched. If you go high, you might get hung out to dry. But Johnson had the mechanical confidence to put his car anywhere. He made moves that were aggressive, bordering on reckless, but the car just stuck. It stuck because he was generating downforce on demand. He took the checkered flag. The crowd went wild. Jimmie Johnson, the Daytona 500 champion. Fireworks, confetti, the burnout on the front stretch. It was the pinnacle of the sport. Chad Knaus stood on the pit box, headset around his neck, trying to look like a man who was just happy to win rather than a man who had just pulled off the greatest heist in NASCAR history. But the race is only the first half of the competition. The second half happens in the inspection bay. After the victory lane photos, after the champagne has been sprayed and the hats have been worn, the winning car is pushed into the garage for a complete teardown. This is the moment of truth. The car is hot, smelling of rubber and spent fuel. The inspectors are tired, but they are thorough. They descended on the 48 car like vultures. They measured the engine displacement, legal. They checked the fuel cell, legal. They measured the roof height, legal. Then came the moment that must have stopped Knaus's heart. An inspector leaned into the cockpit. He looked at the dashboard. He traced the cables. He saw the track bar adjuster. He nodded. Okay. He didn't see the secondary cable. He didn't see the hidden routing through the roll bar. He didn't see the hinged mounts on the C-pillars. The deception held up. The camouflage worked. The car was cleared. Johnson was officially the winner. The trophy was his. The check was his. For a few days, it seemed like they had gotten away with it. The team went back to North Carolina to celebrate. The media moved on to the next story. The 048 team had committed the perfect crime. But there's a saying in the garage, loose lips sink ships, or in this case, loose lips get crew chiefs suspended. The unraveling of the scheme didn't come from a brilliant inspector or a rival team's protest. It came from inside the house. To this day, the identity of the person is a guarded secret, a ghost story told in hushed tones around Mooresville. But the rumor is that a disgruntled employee at Hendrick Motorsports, someone who perhaps felt undervalued, or maybe someone who just had a crisis of conscience, picked up the phone. They called NASCAR, and they didn't just leave a vague tip. They gave them the blueprints. They told them exactly where to look. They said, check the C-pillars, check the roll cage tubing, check the secondary linkage on the track bar adjuster. You can imagine the scene at NASCAR headquarters. The blood must have drained from their faces. They just crowned the champion who was driving a transformer. If this was true, they looked like fools. They had been duped on the biggest stage in the world. NASCAR didn't waste time. They demanded the car back. Bring it to the R&D center, now. When the 48 car arrived at the Research and Development Center in Concord, the mood was different. This wasn't the routine inspection. This was an interrogation. The officials knew exactly where to look this time. They didn't just glance at the adjuster, they took it apart. They didn't just tap on the C-pillars, they put force on them. They actuated the lever, and there it was. The window moved. It was subtle. It was elegant, it was undeniable. As the adjuster turned, the C-pillars bowed out, the glass angle changed, and the aerodynamic profile of the car shifted. The inspector stood back, staring at the mechanism in a mix of anger and sheer admiration. It was brilliant engineering, it was a work of art, and it was completely, unequivocally illegal. So now NASCAR faced a nightmare scenario. The Daytona 500 was over. The fans had gone home. The TV ratings were in. The checks had been cashed. Jimmie Johnson was the winner. But he had won with a cheated car. What do? Do you strip the win? If you do that, you admit that your inspection process is flawed. You admit that you let a cheater stand in victory lane. It's a PR disaster. It delegitimizes the entire event. Fans feel cheated. Sponsors get angry. But if you let them keep the win, you are effectively sanctioning cheating. You are telling the garage that rules don't matter as long as you don't get caught until Tuesday. The decision makers at NASCAR sat in a conference room, staring at the evidence, weighing the integrity of the sport against the public relations fallout. They had to thread the needle. They had to punish Chad Knaus severely enough to stop anyone else from trying this, but they had to protect the image of their biggest race. They came up with a punishment that was swift, brutal, and bizarrely contradictory, a punishment that would change the trajectory of Jimmie Johnson's career and cement Chad Knaus' legacy not as a villain, but as a martyr for speed. The press release dropped like a bomb in the NASCAR community. The verdict was in. Chad Knaus was suspended for 4 races. He was fined $25,000. The team was docked 25 owner points. It sounded harsh. It sounded like justice. But then came the kicker, the asterisk that wasn't there. Jimmie Johnson kept the win. The reasoning was a masterclass in bureaucratic gymnastics. NASCAR's official stance was that the car had passed inspection at the track. The violation was discovered after the event had officially concluded, and the results were certified. Therefore, the results stood. But everyone in the garage knew the real reason. Taking away the Daytona 500 trophy is messy. It's ugly. It tells the fans that what they watched on Sunday didn't matter. So Johnson kept the ring, Knaus took a vacation, and Hendrick paid the fine, which, let's be honest, was pocket change for an organization with that kind of budget. This decision sent a very specific message to every engineer, fabricator, and crew chief in the sport. You can cheat. You can push the boundaries until they break, and if you're clever enough to get through the initial inspection, the worst thing that happens is you get a timeout. But the banner stays on the wall. It was open season. The C-pillar trick didn't just change the rules, it changed the mindset. Before this, cheating was often crude, soaking tires in chemicals, using oversized engines, hiding nitrous oxide. But Knaus had elevated it to an art form. He showed that the real speed wasn't in the engine, it was in the flexibility of the body. He proved that a rigid object, a car made of steel, could be made fluid. Almost immediately, the flexible body revolution began. It was like Pandora's box had been smashed open with a sledgehammer. Every team went back to their shops and looked at their cars with fresh eyes. If the C-pillars could move, what else could move? Suddenly, we saw side skirts that would flare out to seal the car to the track, creating massive downforce, only to snap back into place when the car slowed down for inspection. We saw rear quarter panels that would cave in at high speed to reduce drag. We saw front splitters that were mounted on materials that softened with heat, allowing the nose of the car to drop illegally low onto the track surface as the race went on. NASCAR spent the next 5 years playing the world's most expensive game of whack-a-mole. They would ban one thing, and the teams would invent 3 others. They mandated braces for the C-pillars to stop the Knaus trick. Fine. The teams just started making the braces flexible. They started using materials that look like steel, but bent like rubber. It was a golden age of engineering paranoia. Crew chiefs became obsessed with what the 48 team was doing. They hired photographers to zoom in on Johnson's car during practice. They recorded audio of the car going by to see if the engine note changed, implying traction control. Knaus had become the boogeyman. He was living rent-free in the heads of every competitor. And the irony? The suspension didn't even slow them down. With Knaus sitting on his couch at home, banned from the track, Jimmie Johnson went out and won the very next race at Las Vegas. Then he finished second. Then he won again. It was demoralizing for the competition. It proved that the system Knaus had built, the team, the car, the preparation, was bigger than one man. Or perhaps it proved that the car had other secrets that NASCAR still hadn't found. This incident also marked the shift in how NASCAR wrote its rulebook. Before 2006, the rules were prescriptive. Make the car like this. After 2006, the rules became philosophical. They started adding clauses about intent. They added language like parts must serve a singular purpose. They were trying to legislate against creativity. They were trying to stop engineers from thinking like engineers. But you cannot stop innovation. You can only force it deeper underground. The C-pillar adjuster was the tip of the iceberg. It represented a fundamental truth about high-level competition. The rulebook is not a set of laws. It is a set of challenges. It is a puzzle to be solved. For the fans, this era was confusing but electrifying. We knew something was going on. We could see the cars crabbing, we could see the bodies twisting, but we didn't understand the mechanics of it. We just knew that the 48 car was inevitable. It was a machine designed to win, piloted by a driver who was robotic in his consistency, and masterminded by a crew chief who viewed the rulebook as a rough draft. There is a beautiful, dark romance to this story. It harkens back to the roots of the sport. NASCAR was born from moonshiners running illegal whiskey. The very DNA of the sport is about outsmarting the authorities. Junior Johnson, one of the sport's pioneers, famously said, "I could take a piece of wood and make it look like a piece of steel." He would build cars that were 7/8 the size of a legal car, just shrunken down perfectly so the templates wouldn't catch it. Chad Knaus was the spiritual successor to those moonshiners. He didn't wear overalls, he wore a polo shirt. He didn't have grease under his fingernails, he had data traces on his laptop. But the spirit was exactly the same. Catch me if you can. However, as we moved toward the end of the decade, the walls began to close in. The cost of this engineering war was skyrocketing. To build a C-pillar adjuster requires wind tunnels, shaker rigs, CAD designers, and specialized fabrication. The smaller teams couldn't keep up. The gap between the haves, Hendrick, Gibbs, Roush, and the have-nots became a canyon. NASCAR had to act, not just to stop the cheating, but to save the sport from spending itself to death. This led to the introduction of the car of tomorrow in 2007, a boxy, ugly, standardized safety tank that stripped away almost all aerodynamic adjustability. It was the direct response to the Knaus era. It was NASCAR saying, "Fine, if you guys can't play nice with the gray areas, we are removing the gray areas entirely." The C-pillar adjuster was in many ways a swan song. It was one of the last great purely mechanical cheats before the sport moved into the era of spec parts and rigid enforcement. It was the last time a guy with a welder and a clever idea could beat a billion-dollar sanctioning body. But the story doesn't end with the car of tomorrow, because real innovators don't stop, they just pivot. When NASCAR took away the aerodynamic tricks, Knaus and the 48 team turned their attention to something else: suspension geometry, rear toe, skew. The tricks got smaller, harder to see, harder to explain, but just as effective. Jimmie Johnson went on to win 5 championships in a row. 5! In a sport designed for parity, where the rules are written to make everyone equal, that shouldn't be possible. You don't win 5 straight titles by being just a little bit better. You win 5 straight titles by knowing something no one else knows. You win by playing a different game. And every time Johnson hoisted that trophy, in the back of everyone's mind, the fans, the rivals, the officials, was that image of the rear window at Daytona. The memory of the device that wasn't there. The question that will never truly be answered: what else are they doing right now that we won't find out about for another 10 years? That is the legacy of the track bar trick. It wasn't just a mechanical device. It was a psychological weapon. It made the competition doubt themselves. It made them chase ghosts. While other teams were trying to copy the C-pillar trick, Knaus had already moved on to the next 3 innovations. He kept them looking backward while he was moving forward. So, was it cheating? Yes. By the letter of the law, absolutely. But was it wrong? That's a harder question. If the goal of a race team is to win, and the job of the crew chief is to provide the fastest possible car, then Knaus did his job to perfection. He found a way to win that required more skill, more engineering, and more guts than anyone else. In a way, you have to respect the hustle. You have to respect the sheer audacity of hiding a forbidden mechanism inside the most inspected part of the car. It's like robbing a bank by hiding the money in the police chief's office. It's so bold that it circles back around to being admirable. Today, we look at the NASCAR Cup Series and we see a very different landscape. We see the next-gen car, a machine that is almost entirely spec. The chassis are bought from a single supplier. The bodies are composite, identical down to the micron. The suspension parts are sealed. The days of a fabricator in a dark corner of the shop banging on a fender with a hammer to get an extra count of downforce are effectively over. The sport has moved from an art form to a science, from a battle of creativity to a battle of execution. And while the racing is close and the cars look great, some of us, the ones who love the nuts and bolts, can't help but miss the chaos of 2006. We miss the era when a guy like Chad Knaus could look at a rulebook and see it not as a wall, but as a door. Because, let's be honest, we don't just watch racing for the drivers, we watch it for the machines. We watch it to see human ingenuity pushed to the absolute limit. And there is something deeply satisfying about seeing someone outsmart the system. It appeals to the rebel in all of us. It reminds us that no matter how many rules you write, no matter how many sensors you install, the human brain will always find a way around them. The C-pillar adjuster is a relic now. It belongs in a museum right next to Smokey Yunick's 7/8 scale Chevelle and the Toyota turbochargers from WRC that bypass the restrictor plates. But its ghost still haunts the garage. Every time a team gets caught with a modified louver or a piece of tape in the wrong place or a wheel well that's been manipulated, the whispers start again. Is this a Mother Chad Knaus moment? And what about that whistleblower? That unnamed employee who brought the whole house of cards down? Their story is the tragic footnote to the saga. In a world where loyalty is the only currency that matters, they spent theirs to clear their conscience. We don't know who they are. They likely left the sport, blacklisted, their career over. It's a stark reminder that while we celebrate the genius of the cheat, there are real human costs involved. It's not just metal and physics, it's careers, reputations, and livelihoods on the line. But history is written by the victors, and Chad Knaus is undeniably a victor. 7 championships, 81 wins, a Hall of Fame jacket. The suspension in 2006 is just a blip on his radar, a funny story he tells at banquets. He survived the scandal, he adapted to the punishments, and he continued to dominate. That, perhaps, is the true mark of greatness. Anyone can cheat once, but to be caught, punished, publicly shamed, and then come back and crush the competition for another decade, that requires a level of resilience that goes beyond engineering. So when you look back at that 2006 Daytona 500, don't just see a race, see it for what it really was. A heist, a beautifully executed, high-speed robbery performed in front of millions of witnesses who didn't see a thing. Jimmie Johnson wasn't just driving a Chevrolet, he was driving a philosophy. He was driving the embodiment of the idea that it's better to beg for forgiveness than ask for permission. And the car itself, the number 48 Monte Carlo that started it all, it sits in the collection, silent now. The cables are probably still there, hidden inside the roll bars, rusted tight with age. The C-pillars are stiff, the magic is gone. But if you stand next to it and you listen closely, you can almost hear the ghost of that mechanism clicking. You can imagine the window bowing out, catching the air, and pushing the car forward into history. This story forces us to ask ourselves a difficult question. What is the line between cheating and innovation? Is the spirit of the rules a real thing, or is it just a fairy tale we tell ourselves to feel better when we lose? In the cold, hard reality of professional sports, the only thing that matters is the scoreboard. And on that day in February, the scoreboard said Jimmie Johnson was the winner. The inspection report said he was legal. The history books say he's a legend. Maybe we should stop looking for the clean winner. Maybe we should embrace the fact that motorsport is, at its core, a dirty game. It's a game of mud, grease, gasoline, and lies. And the best liars are the ones who get the biggest trophies. Chad Knaus lied to NASCAR. He lied to the fans, and he lied to his competitors. And he did it with such brilliance that 20 years later, we are still talking about it with a smile on our faces. That is the power of the gray area. That is the allure of the unfair advantage. And that is why, no matter how much they standardize the cars, we will always be looking for the next trick. We will always be waiting for the next Chad Knaus to come along and show us something impossible. Because without the cheaters, the outlaws, and the rule breakers, racing would just be cars driving in circles. And where's the fun in that? As we wrap this up, I want you to think about the technology in your own driveway. Think about the computers, the sensors, the perfectly optimized fuel injection. It's all trickled down from racing. But the spirit of that innovation, the drive to make it better, faster, smarter, that comes from people who refuse to accept limits. It comes from the people who looked at a track bar adjuster and saw a window adjuster. This is the story of the day NASCAR got played. It's the story of the day physics got bent. And it is, without a doubt, one of the greatest moments in the history of the automobile. I'm really curious to know where you stand on this. Was Chad Knaus a genius who exposed the flaws in the system, or was he a cheater who stole a Daytona 500 victory? Does the fact that everyone else was probably cheating too make it okay? Or is a rule a rule? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one, and I love seeing the debate between the letter of the law guys and the spirit of the racing guys. Also, if you enjoyed this deep dive into the darker side of engineering, I have a whole series planned on the banned technologies of Formula One, the hidden fuel tanks of Group B Rally, and the secret traction control systems of the 90s. If that sounds like your kind of content, make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss it. This has been Legacy Motoring. Keep your eyes on the track, but keep your mind on the garage, because that's where the real race is won. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.